All right, welcome everyone to the October 6th Policy Committee meeting of the Commission on Police Practices for the City of San Diego. So I guess we'll just officially call the meeting to order at 5:33, and I'll turn it over to Charmaine to do roll call.
Chair Hilbert.
I'm here.
First Vice Chair Case is absent. Commissioner Dalbert Griffin.
I'm here.
Commissioner Vaughn.
Present.
And Commissioner Dent.
Here.
Thank you. And we have from Internal Affairs.
So we have
Supreme, Lieutenant Syson, and Lieutenant Smartlock. That completes roll call.
all right, and then there's a little, and Charmaine, you can correct me if I misspeak on this. When we sent out the initial agenda, there was a slight error in it. So we actually did send out an amended minutes. And actually here, I'll share my screen and I can show what the changes were. All right, 1 second, I'll scroll down. So this page here was the one that was sent out that actually has the error. So what, wait, I take that back. Yep. So the yellow is what has been changed. So this is the old version. So this is what has been revised in the new section. And this is probably what you guys most recently looked at. This one here is the corrected minutes for our August 11th meeting. So basically it has the corrected votes and all of that. So Charmaine, did I capture that fairly accurate? Okay.
That's correct.
So with that update, are there any revisions or changes to the minutes from the 8/11 meeting minutes? And if not, can I get a motion to approve?
So
Well, I was gonna say, I'll make a motion. So we'll go with that, Nancy, and I'll second it.
okay.
And with that, Charmaine, can you call a vote to approve the amended meeting minutes?
Sure. Commissioner Dalbert Griffin.
Yes.
Commissioner Vaughn.
Yes.
Commissioner Dent. Commissioner Dent. Is she there?
I'm pretty sure she's still here. Let me check. She's here, but she's just muted.
Okay, so we're going to Commissioner Dent. Last chance. Mark is excused. Chair Hilbert.
I will vote yes.
Motion passes 3-0-0.
All right. And then non-agenda public comment. I don't believe we've received any through the web form. Is that correct?
You're correct.
And then we do have one member of the public here. John, I don't know if you wanted to make any non-agenda public comment, or if you're just here to observe. If you want to speak, go ahead and raise your hand or speak.
No, I'm just here to observe. No comment right now.
Perfect. Sounds good. So with that, we're going to move on to the unfinished business. So some of these items we've tabled, and we will have probably continued to table them until the commission is fully up and running and has been gone through the whole implementation ordinance piece. So the first item we had was the third-party mediation. That's one that will be tabled until that's fully funded. We're able to hire a mediation coordinator. Number two, we have reviewing the homeless encampment sweep procedures. We were going to continue to do some more research on that, try to find out what the best practices are throughout the county and the country. And I don't believe we've actually made much progress on that. So I think that one's still, yep, I see a shaking head. So that's still tabled for now. The other item, we did have a meeting with the chief of police and internal affairs yesterday. That was with our the commission's cabinet. And we did go over our most recent memo, which actually I have, whoops, that's the wrong one. There we go. So I do have some slight updates that I can probably share. So the first item was the body worn camera recommendations. We had initially made some recommendations, and then after that, the city auditor made a round of recommendations, and the commission basically fully agrees and believes that the auditor's recommendations are good and solid. It actually would go beyond what our recommendations were, and the department has agreed to implement those. So that's kind of going through that process. They did share with us that the audit is going to be going to public safety and livable neighborhoods. I believe it was next week, and that some of those body worn cameras are kind of going through the meet and confer process with the union. So that one is kind of working its way through the process there. The second item was the body worn camera auditing. We had made a recommendation quite a while ago that we wanted supervising employees of the police department to be able to review body worn cameras. Just right now, what they're doing is they look to say, okay, Officer Smith had 10 enforcement contacts, and therefore there are 10 BWC videos. And right now they're just looking at the number. And we were actually proposing that they look at some of those videos. We were initially told that because of the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding with the union, that they could not do that. And then what they had actually said to the auditor, we felt was a little bit different. So we asked for some clarification. They did tell us that they weren't going to watch them all, but they were going to try to make sure that it was the enforcement contact piece. But again, if they accept all of the recommendations from the city auditor, the whole enforcement contact thing is going to change anyway. So that's kind of changing in process. The other one we had was the investigation of complaints that involve SGPD leadership. The commission made a recommendation that if anyone files a complaint against a captain or higher, that they would have a separate policy that would address how that's investigated. So right now, there's one policy and it applies to every employee of the police department, either sworn or civilian. And internal affairs police, feel free to correct me if I misspeak. But right now that one process follows everybody. So it could be the chief of police all the way down to someone who's writing parking meter tickets. So we wanted it to be a little bit more clear and then kind of have a process where if there's a conflict of interest to have a very clear example of who would then be doing that investigation. The idea being that if a captain or an assistant chief had a complaint against them, does it really make sense to have internal affairs be doing that complaint? There could be an appearance of conflict. That one, the department has basically told us they are not going to change their policy. And so eventually I'm sure we'll get the written response on that. The discipline manual and matrix changes. We had a conversation, had some pretty good feedback going back and forth. The department is in the process of revising the discipline matrix and manual. We did also ask that once they're done with that we be allowed to see that before it goes through meet and confer. So if we have any concerns or changes, we could hopefully get those incorporated before it went into meet and confer. And the department, I don't think, is going to do that. I think they're going to send it to meet and confer, then we can review it, and then it would potentially have to go back to meet and confer. So we don't really have an ETA on when that update will be completed, but I know they are working on that. The other issue here, this was kind of I think we made our initial recommendation. We wanted to have some kind of tracking process to make sure that once an officer has a sustained finding for misconduct, that discipline goes through the process properly. Unfortunately, we've had some cases where things slide between the cracks and command changes in the division and they don't necessarily know that there's discipline waiting to be reviewed, that there's been some discipline that hasn't taken place as it probably should have. And so we wanted to have some tracking that took place. Unfortunately, from our first memo, I think the department misunderstood what we were asking for. And they basically said, per the Police Officer Bill of Rights, that they can't do that. It's called red flagging, which wasn't what we were asking for. We were actually just trying to make sure that once there is a sustained discipline case, that there's a process in place to make sure that the command knows that they have to do their discipline within X number of days to make sure it follows that 1 year timeline. So we basically said we'd be happy to discuss that further with them to make sure that the needs are being met. They did share with us that they are making some changes to how that process goes through to try to make sure that the captains have more ability to review everything properly and getting that done quickly. This last piece here, I did have a conversation with Captain Jeff Jordan. He handles legislative affairs and such and all the policies. There's a couple of recommendations we had made in some cases almost a year ago that the policy they've agreed to, the department's agreed to do that, but the policies have not yet been changed. Part of it's just the legal process. It has to go through They're legal, then it has to go through meet and confer in some cases. And then it also has to go to the city HR department. And so there's a whole process that comes beyond after they've just agreed to it. So there's these two policies that they've told us that they are in the works, and it's just kind of winding its way through the system. So that was the updates for our memo recommendations. Does anyone have questions on those? Okay. So for new business, some of these we had on here before. Obviously, we had the meeting with the chief, and based on some of the responses, some of them are moot, and I'll go into those in a little bit. The first item we had here was how the department handles officer BWC, body-worn camera violations, if it's an OIS, an officer involved shooting case. So the way the system works right now is the officer who's involved, subject officer of an officer involved shooting, there is what's called told. So during the whole process where it's being reviewed by the DA to see if there's any criminal liability of the officer, that 1 year timeline is put on hold. So there's a little bit of a quirk there, is if there's an associated officer who in this case doesn't turn their body worn camera on, we don't get to see that report until after the DA has determined the officer bears no criminal liability. But that other officer, because they weren't the subject officer of the shooting, they don't have that tolling period of that 1 year. So by the time we get the case, if there are additional findings against other officers, that 1 year mark realistically has most likely expired. So we had a case that there was an officer involved shooting, and then some of the other officers who showed up on scene failed to activate their camera. So we asked the department to do another finding for those officers for a BWC violation. They agreed to do that. But what in the past happened is, even though that was a separate case, because we have oversight over the officer involved shooting, they would also allow us to review that BWC violation. And we've been doing that for about 3 or 4 years, if I remember correctly. And it's just kind of, they've just done it that way. That's what we've kind of agreed to. And that's the process that we were doing. There's nothing written that confirmed that. Now, currently, the department has decided, well, that's technically an internal. And so you guys don't get to review internals. And so we're no longer going to show those to you. So obviously, we as a commission don't really like that. But the idea was, we were doing it that way in the past. We'd like to continue to do it that way in the future. The department isn't going to change on that, to be honest. We had the meeting with the chief, and that's just the way they're going to do it from now. The one difference is, going forward, after the implementation ordinance, we will be able to review those because we can also review internal misconduct. So I don't really know if now makes the sense to really fight it, because it's going to change in several months once the implementation ordinance moves through. But that was kind of the issue there. We were going to possibly make a recommendation, a formal recommendation, to ask them to change their policy. After our conversation with the chief, that's not going to happen. So I don't even know if it makes sense for us to move forward. Does anyone have any questions on that first item? Okay. The second item. So, and I can share this as well. For the public, what we do is we review both Category 1 and we audit Category 2 complaints. So Category 1 complaints are the most serious, things like use of force, arrest, discrimination. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, I think it's actually 2018 or 2019, we did work with the police department. We also added search and seizure to become a Category 1 type complaint. We're proposing, and we'd like to make a recommendation to add untruthfulness as a Category 1 complaint. So if an officer lies on a report or something like that, that we feel should be a Category 1 issue. I personally think being untruthful is more serious than search and seizure violations. And if the department feels that a search and seizure thing is a Category 1, it seems to say that the truthfulness should also be a Category 1. So that I think would be our recommendation, that we, if we agree on that today, that we move that forward to the full commission to make a recommendation. So with that, I'd like to open it up to any comments or feedback or questions.
I have a question, Brandon.
Yep.
So how would we, because I could see this conversation go in all kinds of ways. And my question is, how would we establish untruthfulness in an officer's report? I mean, it could be untruthfulness. It could also just something having gotten forgotten. It could be something having been misrecalled. It could be all kinds of different things. So how would we establish untruthfulness?
That's, I think, a couple steps down the road. This is actually even before that. So right now, if say I file a complaint against an officer and I say this officer, lied or was untruthful, right now, we would only get that as a Category 2 audit, which means that the division would do that investigation. And then we would only see it after the case was completed and finished. If we move it to a category 1, that means it's automatically something that we would review that case prior to internal affairs closing that case out. The whole process of determining whether or not the officer was truthful, or there is, they just misremembered something or something like that. That's kind of what during their investigation, they will usually try to determine that. And then in the same, like the reports that we see today, they would usually list out, here's what the BWC said, here's what the officers, the arrest report might've said, or things like that. So I think trying to determine how the officer, either were they telling the truth or not, I think that's a different story. And this is just a recommendation to move it from a category 2 to a category 1.
Yes, I understand that. I think and I apologize, I should have been clearer. I was thinking this more so for the future, once the commission is fully established. If it moves to a category 1 case, obviously there will be an investigation from the commission, and that's more where I was going with this.
Yeah, well, as it stands today, the only thing the commission is required to do our own investigation on would be officer-involved shootings and in custody deaths. We do have the opportunity to do an investigation on any case that we pretty much vote to deem relevant to doing an investigation on. So I think we would have to figure that out. If we were getting to that level where we wanted to do an investigation on something like untruthfulness, that would be part of the forthcoming operating procedures for investigations.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
I know that was a lot of words. And it's kind of complicated because we're not quite there yet.
I know.
Yeah. Nancy, go ahead.
The only place I've seen something like this claimed is not as a standalone allegation, but usually in with other allegations like force or arrest or detention. And so I'm not sure. It's not something that we could bring or that you would expect, although I suppose the IA sergeant doing the investigation, if he saw something, could add it. I don't know, Brandon.
And I think also, and IA can correct me on this. I would think that maybe some of the complaints are, I was on trial and the officer lied, when he was under oath. I think that might be worse.
That.
Yeah,
We've had that before.
And I think there's also cases where someone's like, the arrest report, they lied about the situation that happened. And I would agree with you. I think more often than not, those are usually an untruthfulness allegation usually comes along with several others, whether
Right.
it's arrest or force or something like that. Those would be category 1s anyway. But if there was a solo case where someone just says, the officer lied, and there's no other complaints, then that would be a category 2. And then we would not see that usually. Well, if they did a written complaint, then we would have to get that. I think our thought process was, and this was actually, I believe it was Doug that I think made this recommendation. I think the thought process is if something as I don't say as simple, but something like search and seizure is a category 1, something like untruthfulness, which per the discipline matrix, if an officer is found to have a sustained finding for lying on a report and being untruthful, they get terminated. So something that I think is that severe, it seems like that'd be appropriate that we would also categorize that, or the department categorize that as a category 1 as well.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? All right, and then again, IA, if I misspeak or you want to add some context or color to anything, please feel free to chime in. I don't want to silence anyone from sharing their opinions. So not seeing any other hands up, the motion will be to recommend to the full commission that we make a recommendation to the police department to recategorize untruthfulness allegations as a category 1 instead of a category 2.
So move.
I will second that.
Sorry, question. Are we as a standalone offense, or it always in combination with others, or any?
Well, if the department were to adopt and accept our recommendation, if someone filed a complaint that just said an officer was untruthful and nothing else, that would still become a category 1.
Okay.
And it would go through the same process, like if someone says, hey, I was arrested and I shouldn't have been, or an officer used force and was unnecessary. I mean, it would go through that exact same process that we do now, where they do their proper investigation, they look at all the facts, and then they determine whether or not that allegation was correct, or exonerated, sustained, not sustained, etc.
Okay.
All right, so we have a motion by Nancy, a second by me, Brandon. Charmaine, can you call vote, please?
Commissioner Tabitha Griffin,
Yes.
Commissioner Vaughn,
Yes.
Commissioner Dent,
Yes.
Chair Hilbert,
I will vote yes.
motion passes 4-0.
All right, this one might take a tiny bit longer. The protest procedure officially is called the First Amendment. Well, actually, let me go to it. It's the First Amendment Activities Facilitation and Management. We did make a recommendation to the police department, and they did give us a response. And I think that if I remember right, they categorized things in kind of 3 different blocks. The first one was, we agree with your recommendation, we're going to implement it. There's another one that basically was that they needed to do some more research on what the legal standards were and whether or not our recommendations were feasible. And then the last one was that they were not going to implement that. So since then, there were also some state law changes. And so the state law added a bunch of different things that, and a lot of them actually kind of supported many of what our recommendations were. So what I did on this document here, this came out in August. And then as with all their procedures, once they have new edits, they'll actually mark, and as I scroll down a little bit, you'll see it. There's a little box to the left, rather, that'll say new, like right here, of what they've changed to that document. So what I tried to do is I looked at both documents, the old one and the new one, and as best as I could, I highlighted what was either a new addition or a change. So for this piece here, when they're just explaining what unlawful assembly is, and this was one of our recommendations, we wanted to make sure that the first pass, it was a little bit vague, I think the commission felt, and we were a little bit concerned that just because there was a protest that was boisterous or tumultuous, that was the legal definition. We didn't want the department to basically be saying that it's an unlawful assembly just because something's loud and obnoxious. And so they basically essentially agreed with us, and they put this change in there to basically say that a loud event doesn't, by itself being loud, create an unlawful assembly. So, and if there's anyone that has questions or comments as we go, please feel free to chime in. I mean, there's not too many on here. I'll scroll over all the stuff that doesn't have changes because we don't really think we need to go over that again. And then once we get to, so down here on dispersal orders, again, they just added this one sentence. Says the incident commander should consider persons with mobility issues when evaluating how they can basically get out of that protest area. Again, that was one of our recommendations. We also had a recommendation on if people were hard of hearing, for example. And so the department, I think, did kind of try to incorporate many of those concerns we had into the updated agreement. For the dispersal order itself, they did modify this one piece of if people don't disperse after a protest has been declared unlawful, what happens? And basically, they just kind of modified how that process would happen. And so the idea here is if you don't disperse, they could use like OC spray or chemical agents or other weapons. And I think, and IA, correct me if you know more than I do on this, I think what they're trying to do is saying, given the situation at hand, that they're not going to put out this whole list of we're going to use rubber bullets and flashbangs and all that stuff when that's not what they're intending on using. So I think it's just kind of clarifying it to make sure it reflects the situation at hand and what the department would have to use if they needed to in that situation. Personally, I find that change 100% acceptable. But let me know if, again, raise your hand or speak up if anyone wants to chime in. This other section here, this whole section 8, everything including all of these ABCD, all of that is new. But again, what they're doing is they're trying to say what command needs to consider and factor into their decision when they decide to deliver and document the dispersal orders. So one of the concerns we had was trying to make sure that if you have, perhaps like a really large event that maybe goes a couple city blocks, our concern is we didn't want people maybe in the front to be able to hear that dispersal order, but people in the back that maybe like 2 or 3 blocks away to not hear that and then potentially get caught in the dispersal actions. And so I think everything they had here, I think is appropriate. We actually asked them to do the disposal order at least 3 times. And I think we actually even said we want it to be like at least, when practical, a minute or 2 minutes apart. So obviously we don't want them giving the order back to back 3 times. Okay, we did it 3 times. And I think all the changes they put here, to be honest, I think really address many of the recommendations we had made. One of them, for example, F was, for people that maybe can't hear, display signage, including electric signage or billboards. And then, some of these I think were even more than what we asked for, like getting attention to the crowd by documenting affirmative responses from crowd members, showing that obviously they heard it. Community alert systems, acquiring multiple language capability. That was one of the questions we had about people who may not speak English or Spanish, which is kind of the default. And they even had using social media as well, which is not something we had recommended, but something they put in there. So I actually feel like these are pretty solid changes. And I don't have any concerns with them. Number 9, one of the things that we asked is with EMS, the idea, and the department, I won't say pushed back, but they basically said, well, we don't have, command and we can't tell EMS what to do. It's a different department. But we said, like, if you obviously know that there's going to be a protest and there's a chance there's going to be like OC spray or things used, to make sure that EMS has, decontamination things on like water on hand. And so the change they made here basically kind of says, we don't have jurisdiction over them, but at the same time, officers can suggest that EMS do what they need to do to make sure that they have water on hand if they need to decontaminate people from OC spray. And again, I think that's a solid change, and I don't have any concerns with that. Again, a lot of this is just the same document. There are changes based on updates to the California law, and I believe the next one is one of the Assembly bill changes. The only change here is basically they added a new section, and so they basically just said refer to that section for the use of specialty munitions. We did have some recommendations on how these would be used that I'd have to go back and double check, but I think that was one of the ones that the department said that they were not going to change because they didn't want to limit themselves on something that they might need to use at some point in the future. We did also ask for a couple ways, like with flex cuffs, to make sure we actually wanted them to potentially have officers write their name on the flex cuff so you could tell who arrested who. Say, for example, there was an event where hundreds of people were arrested. It's kind of hard to know who took command and control of various people. But that was something that we were told wasn't really feasible to be doing out in the field during a quickly moving protest event. So this whole section here, section X, as you saw up above, this whole section here is added, but it talks mostly about how Assembly Bill 48 changed how police departments throughout the state of California can use projectiles and chemical agents to disperse crowds. I'll leave this up here just so if you guys want to scan through it real quick. When I read it, I don't really have any concerns with it. I think, really, and as the department shared with us yesterday, this was really all dictated by California state law. So I don't really think there's anything, at least that I saw from my first pass, that I would ask to make changes on. And again, this was based on legal changes that the department had their attorneys, I'm sure, review before they obviously put this out. I will say the last document was, I believe, 15 pages. This one's 20, so it did go up in size a bit. But one of the things here that I thought was also good, and it kind of goes along with our our recommendations, was that like OC spray or rubber bullets or things like that, that they should not be used to impose curfew violations, verbal threats, or just simply not complying with law enforcement directives. And that was one of the recommendations we had kind of basically said, is we don't want people getting pepper spray just because they're not, quote, going along with the program. And then there is the resources section, which is unchanged. And then they did make some changes to basically media and public information. This was an area where we did make several recommendations. So basically, this whole section was kind of revised, but really B and C were marked as new. But from my read, I don't think this section was in there at all. So we had actually made quite a few recommendations, and my reading of this, I'm good with it. Basically, it says that the media shouldn't be targeted specifically for filming and reporting the news. But it also has some components in there that basically says if the media is preventing law enforcement officers from arresting people, then obviously that's a different story and that's another problem, which, I mean, that seems to make sense as well. There's a section here, number D. Members of media may not interfere with arrests, assault officers, or commit criminal acts under local, state, or federal law. And the last section was mutual aid, and then after action reports, and those remain unchanged. So with that, I think this is something that we will probably report back to the full commission. We can talk about it at our next open session meeting. I don't really have any recommendations to make on this. I think the changes from a wholesale level are actually quite good, but I wanted to open it up to any questions or comments or feedback. And if there is none, we'll probably just bring it up to the commission for us to discuss at our open session meeting. All right, looks like everyone might be okay on that one. Number D, or letter D, we actually were going to make a recommendation on this, but the department agreed to do this for us when we met with them. Well, actually, when we had our last meeting, Chief McGrath said he would do it, and then yesterday at our meeting, they basically agreed that they would do it again. So currently, we, the commission, don't always receive updates to policies or procedures. It's posted on the police department's website, but they didn't always tell us when those policies are being changed. What they do is they notify all the police officers whenever there's a change, because obviously the officers need to know what the policies are and what the changes have been. So we asked to be notified at the same time as police officers, and the department has agreed to do that. So I left this on here just as kind of a report out item, and then we can share this at the open meeting. But at this point, I don't think we need to make a recommendation since they've already agreed to do it. The other one we had was from the use of force. We want to add a time requirement for when a use of force report must be completed. Again, we had a conversation with the chief yesterday about that. In general, the rule is that a use of force report must be completed by the end of an officer's shift. What had kind of sparked this is we had a complaint that came in where the officer reviewed their body-worn camera after they were told that they were a subject officer to a complaint, and then they submitted a use of force report, which kind of raised some flags, because that basically, I think it was like 28 days or 22 days after the incident happened. So reading 1.04, which is the use of force procedure, my review, and again, please feel free to chime in if I misspeak, I didn't read anywhere in there where it provides a time limit or a requirement for the officer to complete that. So theoretically, the way I read it is, you know, if someone files that report 6 months or a year after, that still technically is within policy, which doesn't really seem right. Again, the chief said, no, the expectation is, with some very small carve outs, the expectation is an officer fills out that report by the end of their shift. Which I think would have been what our recommendation is that, you know, by the time an officer clocks out for the day, they should have those reports completed. So I think for right now, this isn't going to be a recommendation, but it's something that I think we're going to probably come back and revisit. But IA, do you want to chime in on anything on that?
Yeah, Brandon, I think it's written in another policy about report writing and documenting reports that it has to be done at the end of the shift. And the only way that it can be delayed is with approval of a shift supervisor. And that pertains to all reports.
Okay. I think what we might possibly want to do then is just, and we've sometimes done this, I know the department hasn't always been a fan of it, is have it be something that is reiterated in that policy. So maybe we add that back to 1.04, but I'll actually try to, preparing for this, I didn't actually review the report writing procedure. So I'll actually take a look at that and I'll see, and maybe we can look at making a change there if we need it. But I'm not going to make a recommendation on this yet, because I think we still need to do a little bit of research just to make sure. But also hearing the department kind of say what their expectations are, I think aligns with what we would hope and expect. So I don't have a recommendation on that now. Are there any questions or comments? I saw earlier a couple of heads nodding, and I didn't know if that was just agreement or wanting to ask a question.
I second what the captain said. I've seen it, and we've held officers to that before, so I think that's already covered.
Yeah, I think, and not getting into case specific matters, but the concern the team had was that if it wasn't for the complaint, that use of force, well, in that case, it was a show of force, really, would never have been completed. And that was, I think, the team's concern when they raised that issue.
Could have been another finding, I guess, that he didn't get it done the day of the incident.
Well, I think the issue is internal affairs is saying that's not a violation. So that was our concern, which is what brought up this recommendation. But I think we need to do a little bit of research just to make sure that we're not doing something that's already there. So I'll look at that other procedure, and then if we need to, we can bring this back.
Yes. Hey, Brandon, can I speak on that? It's Lieutenant.
Please do.
Yeah. In that incident, the officer did not have to do a report. So when he did his report, it really didn't matter. You know what I'm saying? So that show of force, it was a show of force. It was not a use of force, and so he didn't feel that he needed to do. He didn't need to do one. Period. So, but for him to go back and do one, which is fine, because officers do reports all the time on different things that they really don't have to do a report on. But we encourage our officers to document as much as possible, and so that's what he did. So.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to. Thanks for sharing that. I don't want to get too into case-specific issues because obviously we try to keep those fairly confidential. And I know the policy is changing in the future regarding use of force and show of force reports, but that's down the road. But I think we're all good on that. Just checking. Okay, no more hands. The other one we had was discipline memos. So again, we brought this up in the meeting we had yesterday with the chief. Typically, when the commission gets a discipline memo, it'll say, Officer X received what their discipline was, the date they received the discipline, and then it'll have a quick little summary of what the issue was that sparked that disciplinary action. But then what it'll also do is usually say, this is the first, second, third, such type of this misconduct. What it won't do is if, say, for example, it was something super simple, like a body-worn camera violation. It would only tell us if this is their first, second, third time where that officer's failed to activate their camera. It won't include other things like, the officer had a sustained finding for being discourteous or something like that, because it's not relevant to that specific action. The other issue is, the next paragraph basically goes to talk about all the positive things that they've done. They've received, commander citations and, various accolades and, things like that. My initial recommendation was that we should probably admit those kudos, because those kudos aren't related to that disciplinary action usually. But so what the department shared with us yesterday, which does kind of make sense, is that sharing those positive accolades goes into the commanding officer's disciplinary, the choice of how they choose to discipline that officer. So say, for example, if in general that officer had a stellar career, they have a lot of accolades and the community's, had sent in, feedback about how great they are. And then, an officer just makes a mistake or does something, maybe just absentmindedly just makes a minor error. They're not going to go for the most severe discipline if, that's kind of a blip and they just made a simple mistake. So initially I was going to say, since all those accolades don't relate to that discipline, if we're not going to talk about past discipline, then we shouldn't talk about other unrelated positives. But the department was basically saying that the command, the chief, or sorry, the captain will usually look at those accolades as part of a way of they're trying to determine how they're going to discipline that officer. So I'm still kind of on the fence on it. I see both sides, but I wanted to open it up to policy committee members to share any feedback or thoughts. And I'm hearing silence. So I think for now, I don't really hear a lot of change to make edits. So I think we'll just go ahead and close that one out altogether, unless anyone disagrees.
I think that's a good idea.
Okay. And then the last item we had here, and again, this is the benefit of having our meeting with the chief yesterday, right before we had policy. The county has a mobile crisis response team now. And so we wanted to get a little more information about how the department refers cases to them and vice versa. So we're going to be trying to have them come in and give us a training presentation at one of our upcoming open session meetings. But one of the things that the department shared with us, and they were going to try to pull some numbers to give us the actual hard numbers. But I believe he said for the city of San Diego, there's only 4 teams, if I remember correctly. And I think he said there was about 4 calls that came in directly from the police department and then got sent over to the mobile crisis response team. So part of the issue is people who are calling mobile crisis response, the whole point is that it bypasses the police department. And so those calls never go to the police department. You don't have the police department responding to, simple things like, maybe I'm hearing voices, is kind of the example they gave. Now, the difference is if someone's like, I'm hearing voices and they want me to do bad things or hurt people, mobile crisis would never respond to that anyway. So then it would be a police related issue. So initially, I think the idea was we were going to try to make a recommendation on how those referrals should take place. I think right now I'm just going to leave this as an action item because I think first we really need to get that presentation from them as to what they do, how they work, and also get some of those numbers from the police department on how many calls have happened. But for right now, I think this is more of an informational item for us to kind of keep on there and to talk about. Andrea, I see your hand up, so go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I've sat in multiple, because I'm a community provider, I've sat in multiple MCRT presentations, and the specific concern here is not necessarily whether SDPD or NEPD and MCRT send referrals between each other, which right now the system is not set up to do that or accomplish that, but rather how would police departments, I guess, pursue a case where, say, somebody calls 911, the call gets routed to PD for whatever reason, and doesn't get routed to MCRT, and there's a suicidal individual, somebody with suicidal ideation, and the police officers go out, but they can't make contact with that person. And because they can't make contact with that person, they leave again. So at that point, what happens in a situation like that? Is a call or referral over to MCRT to notify them that there is somebody out there who has expressed suicidal ideation? Is that warranted? Is that something that can be done? So it was more about the after attempted contact response, if you will, rather than folks calling into the hotline initially. Does that make sense?
It does. I think that's, I think it'd be helpful for us to find out some of the data first about like how many calls are happening. The other issue that the chief shared is from a budgeting standpoint, they don't really have enough money to provide the full resources that are needed. And so I think, and again, I think I have my notes somewhere here. I think they actually were saying that there's only 4. I have the city of San Diego, there's only 4 teams that are assigned specifically to the city of San Diego. And so they were going to try to work on letting us know the types of calls and the number, so we could look at that. I think it's helpful for us to know the number first before we figure out, like, does it really make sense for us to try to create this whole policy or procedure for something that may not really be happening.
Sure. Yeah. And I just want to add that, if somebody truly has suicidal ideation, they're probably not very likely to respond to a police officer trying to make contact with them. And hopefully in the future, these calls will be routed directly to MCRT, of course, provided that there are no other factors involved that would require the presence of the police department. And still, there may be cases where this simply doesn't get divided up neatly that way. So, but yeah, thank you, Brandon.
Yeah, and I think for now, what makes the most sense is we'll just leave this on for a kind of a future research item for us to continue to get more information on, and that way we can figure out what makes the most sense. So does anyone else have any other questions on the items we went over so far? It looks like of the 7 items we had, really only one is a true recommendation, and that is the recategorizing untruthfulness to a category 1. All right, next one on there is future agenda items for committee consideration. Does anyone have anything that you would like to propose for future policy committee recommendations? I know it's kind of more for the public that's here. Typically, whenever we do our case reviews, if someone has a concern from a case, they can put that in their case notes or their team issues and concerns. And then we ask them to do a policy committee referral form. And then that's when I put that on our agenda. So I do always ask in our open session meetings and our closed session meetings, if there's anything that's a policy referral that we'll usually bring in, but I don't think there's any more for right now. I think we've actually been pretty good at trying to get those out and back to the department for them to provide feedback on. All right, well, with that, we're actually done a little bit before our timeline. So I will go ahead and adjourn the meeting at 6:19. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.